Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another one of our Tring Book Festival events. Can I welcome to the stage your host for this event, Pippa Chappell, and Tom Fort.
Well, thank you very much for coming, and welcome again to the Tring Book Festival. I'm really delighted this afternoon to be here talking with Tom Fort about his latest book, Rivets, Trivets and Galvanised Buckets, which is the most fabulous title. It's not easy to say quickly, but it's a wonderful title. Thank you for joining us today, Tom. Tom is a former BBC radio journalist of many years' experience, I think it's fair to say.
Many years ago as well.
And more recently is a writer of a vast range of miscellaneous non-fiction books on a range of subjects to do with our history and our material culture and the environment in which we live. The most famous of which is a book about the A303 titled Highway to the Sun, which some of you may have seen the adaptation on the television as well. And beside being a keen angler, he is, by his own admission, in the pages of the book, a DIY incompetent.
Bungler.
I hesitated to say bungler, but we can go with that. It's a wonderful book. If you haven't had a chance to read it yet, I strongly recommend it. I have learned so many things. I now understand what a one-piece blind rivet is, and that is, given my propensity as a bungler, that's extraordinary. It's a very engaging balance of an account of a family project, a village life, and, as I said, the social and material history of the things we use to make our homes better, we hope, or to cover up the mistakes when we do. So, to begin with, have you been to both of the hardware shops in Tring?
Well, I'd like to say to begin with that I've never been to Tring before this afternoon, and I'm humbled to be in what is obviously the hardware capital of southern England.
Absolutely.
Because as soon as I arrived, I was asked, "Have you seen the hardware shops?" And I thought, what? Anyway, the answer is I have been to both hardware shops, and I can say you are truly blessed in your hardware range of hardware choices, and I'm going to come back and have a because I didn't have any money, so even if I'd wanted to buy something, but I did have a chat with the blokes at Metcalfe's, and they said they were really sorry they couldn't be here, but they had customers to serve.
They had a shop to run. One of the things that struck me in the book too was the difference between an ironmonger's and a hardware shop. I sort of assumed, I think, in my ignorance, that hardware was the American version and ironmonger's was a good, proper British one. But that's not the case.
That is not the case. In fact, that's exactly what I assumed as well when I started doing the research for the book, because hardware sounds American, doesn't it? But in fact, hardware is sort of first noted in the 15th century, applied to hardware, like hard tools, in fact. And it was always ironmongers, right the way through the 19th century. And towards the end of the 19th century, hardware began to be incorporated into those lovely titles over shop windows. And I thought, why? And now it's quite unusual to come across. There are still one or two places that call themselves an ironmongers, where one of my children lives in Todmorden near Manchester, and there's a covered market there, and the hardware shop is an ironmonger's. And I thought, why ironmonger is perfectly good. And I thought that the only answer I could come up with, which you may not think much of, because I'm not sure I think much of it myself, is that ironmonger gets very complicated when you get to plurals of ironmongers, and even more complicated when you get to the possessive of plural ironmongers, and where you put the apostrophe. And I wonder whether people thought this is just, so you think ironmonger, ironmongers, ironmonger, apostrophe S, ironmongers plural, and then if you have more than one ironmongers of the ironmongers, where do you put the apostrophe? Anyway, so my theory, of which I've absolutely no evidence whatsoever, is that it just got hardware was more straightforward. Anyway, they're both old.
So the book deals with, uses kind of as a framework, the shop that you and your daughter-in-law, well,
they're not married, so if we need to get... but we regard her as my daughter. Yeah, so the story began really when I went to live. So I live in a village called Sunning Common, not Sunning, which is where the very smart people like George Clooney live, and the very rich people. Sunning Common is a place a few miles from Sonning. It's very unlike Tring as well. It has no history, it has no claims to distinction of any kind, it has no old buildings, it doesn't even have, it has no village church, village green, or anything like that. It's a construct of the last century, but it does have a hardware shop. And I went to, oops, sorry, am I shouting?
Don't worry, don't worry.
I went to live there about 30 years ago. And like everybody else in the village, I used to go to the hardware shop. Heath and Watkins, there, right? It looks, the cover tells the story. That's exactly how the shop looks, and it has the spirit of it. Heath and Watkins. So, like everybody else, I went there to buy screws and nails and light bulbs and matches and such. But I didn't pay a great deal of attention to it. And then my elder son, did something quite unusual in his life, which was to make a really good choice and decision, which is he got together with a woman called, her name is Sharona. Her mother was pregnant at a time when there was a song of the 80s. Some of you can probably sing it, My Sharona. Anyway, that's how she got her name, Sharona. We call her Shro because Sharona's been a mouthful. And my son got together with her. And Shro is a woman of dreams. She is a dreamer, and one of the dreams that she articulated with us was she longed to have a polytunnel to grow. She's a massive grower, as indeed I am a massive grower of vegetables only. A polytunnel, and that something clicked in my mind. The guy who ran the hardware shop, Mick, with whom I by then had got reasonably friendly. Mick was he'd been a potato factor before becoming a hardware shop owner. And he was a bit of I don't know if any of you remember a TV series called Minder, Arthur Daly. He was a bit like Arthur Daly. And oddly enough, the actor who played Arthur Daly, George Cole, was a regular in the shop, which was a kind of nice coincidence. Anyway, yeah, he was sort of cutter of corners and a bit of a slightly dodgy dealer, but loved to chat. Anyway, became very friendly with him. And I remembered that at the back of the shop was a burnt out ruin of a polytunnel, which one of the blokes who worked in the shop, George, had managed to set fire to some years before. Mick had installed it to grow vegetables to sell in the shop to make money, but he didn't make any money out of them, and he lost interest. So the remains of the polytunnel were there. So I went to Mick and said, could we bring it back to life? And he was delighted. He was delighted. He didn't have to pay anything. As long as he didn't have to pay anything, he was delighted. And actually, he was very keen on potatoes. And one of the things I wanted to do in the polytunnel was to grow potatoes, because I'd never grown potatoes. So one winter's day, I and my wife and Shro and my son Hugh recovered the polytunnel. And we started growing. And as a result, we became more friendly with Mick. And so we come to the climax of this bit part of the narrative, which is one day he said he had been ill for a while, the shop was going downhill, and he said, any chance you might want to take the shop over? And I thought, that is completely insane. I mean, I was a sort of in my late 60s, retired journalist. I wasn't going to become a shopkeeper at that time. And then I thought, stroke. And that's how we, and so we then embarked upon like a lengthy period of negotiation, because I then became, even though I don't know how to run a hardware shop, I became a bit of an expert on lease law and the transfer of leases. So eventually we had the lease transferred, and then on October the 1st, 2018, so just over 5 years ago, she took over.
It's an astonishing thing to take on with no experience.
Well, that's right. And we had what we called, rather absurdly, a grand reopening a couple of months later. And it wasn't a reopening because we never shut. And it was not at all grand either, because the only celebrity I could find, you always need a celebrity at a grand opening. was my brother Matthew, who was I don't know if any of you ever watched a show on the BBC, The Great British Menu. He was one of the judges on The Great British Menu, a rather rotund chap who eats everything in sight, and they sacked him a couple of years ago. So he was the only thing. So he came and we had a ribbon, and I gave him a pair of shears to cut the ribbon, and the shears were completely blunt, and there was a kind of fiasco as we tried to find a pair of scissors. But that evening, so we gave everyone in the village came, and we provided bangers and mulled wine and what have you, and everybody said, you know, so pleased that the shop isn't going to close, and which is very nice. But one of the things we realised, or Schroe realised very early on, is that shops don't stay open because people feel sentimental about them. They stay open because they do a job that the community is prepared to pay for. So that was one of the kind of realities that we bumped into.
That was one of the things that came across very strongly in the book, was the sort of good feeling people have for a good old-fashioned hardware store. There's that lovely phrase where I think it's a little girl comes in and says, "This is the shop of everything." And there is that feeling, that sense of potential, that there's all kinds of things you can make and do, and that, you know, the right screwdriver will make it.
That's right, yeah. It's the hardware shop is the kind of enabler of long delayed projects or dreams or things that you never quite got around to. And one of the things we found, so we ran it it started doing fine. Schroe sort of brightened it up, got new stock and all the rest of it. And then lockdown came. And I mean, I don't know how well you remember what lockdown was like. It seems like another world almost. It was so weird, daily life. But one of the things about lockdown was that people, particularly blokes, were at home for the first time, often because they went out to work. It was the first time they'd been at home for extended periods since, you know, they bought their houses, and being at home and having such restrictions on freedom, people were looking around for things to do, for projects, and our shop was an enabler of those projects to be realised. And so she did just ludicrous business during lockdown, and there were queues and people were incredibly patient. It was, and so takings went through the roof, but actually it wasn't a very satisfactory time because getting stock was really difficult. It was extremely stressful. She couldn't have anyone helping her. Unlike the hardware shops in Tring, where there are multiple staff, our shop is much. So there's only Schroe, and my wife Helen is the other worker there. So she, you know, there was no help for her. And then after that, things calmed down. So yeah, we're doing fine at the moment, and the shop will continue to provide living. And what you were saying about how I think, you know, people value shops, what I would refer to as real shops, like bookshops and hardware shops, and in my case, fishing tackle shops. And some people sort of shops where you go and buy old vinyl LPs and such like. It's places that are not just transactional in their nature, that there is a kind of give and take between staff, or should be between staff and customers, and hardware is very much like that.
Yeah, it came across very strongly in the book, that sense of it as a place in the community where people were recognised and you sort of got to know in some way, and also in terms of finding the right thing for people.
Yes.
That lovely phrase that they're islands of competence.
That's right, but also that competence is limited. So one of the things that is noticeable is how people actually bring their own knowledge to the. So both Schroe and my wife. It's not that they don't like tools; it's that they're not particularly interested in tools. But of course, a certain proportion come in wanting to talk about tools. and so they would learn about tools from people coming in and say, have you got the, oh no, yeah, and that's, and so there's tremendous give and take involved.
Which is lovely. As you say, it's less transactional and more, I can't think of the word, but sort of relational.
Symbiotic.
That's the one, symbiotic. One of the features of the book is this incredible historical perspective on everyday objects. So on the screwdriver and the rivet and sandpaper and all sorts. Wait, we'll get to the bucket in a minute. I was wondering about the process of all that research, because, as I said, I learned an enormous amount reading the book. There's so much detail about trivets, for example, or all manner of things. And I'm wondering about that research process.
Well, the research, when you do, that's the sort of best part of writing a book. I only write non-fiction books, is when you're able to say to your family and those who bother you with annoying requests to do things, I'm sorry, I'm doing research on my book. Which means you leave the house and you go to a library and no one can find you or get hold of you and irritate you. And being in libraries is wonderful. That's but for this book, and this is one of the things that's changed in my sort of writing lifetime, because a lot of things I was writing about are very kind of minority interest. The internet became obvious early on to me was going to be sort of crucial for this, because so I'll give you an example of something really boring in the hardware shop, which is light bulbs. Now, no one can get excited about light bulbs, you would have thought. And Helen, who's my wife, and Shro, they have to deal with light bulbs, but their conversations are very dull conversations about light bulbs. However, all over the sort of Western world, the Northern Hemisphere, there's a community of light bulb enthusiasts. And the wonderful thing about the internet is it enables someone who's interested in light bulbs in Kazakhstan to chat about light bulbs to somebody in Seattle. And then once they get together and they form a community of light bulb enthusiasts, somebody sets up a website and everybody starts putting things onto the website. And then the website becomes like a vast light bulb, I think I said in the book, like a huge emporium full of light bulbs, and you wander in. And then there am I wandered in, helped myself to not light bulbs, but information about light bulbs, picked out the sort of 5 or 6 things that I wanted. So that was terrific. But there was some nice solid library research as well. And one of my absolute favorite bits of that was there's a museum, I forget what it's called, Design and Domestic Architecture or something in Hendon. And I went there and they were very, very helpful. But one of the things they produced for me was a huge stock of old magazines from the 1950s and 60s, the first DIY sort of magazines. So DIY sort of mushroomed after the Second World War with all the materials and tools and whatnot that were available. And then the kind of media exposure sort of goes hand in hand with that. So a magazine came out mid-50s called Practical Householder, and then another one, Do It Yourself and Homemaker. And these are the most fascinating things to look at, not the contents, which are absolutely dreary beyond belief, and articles about how to sort of plumb sinks and such like. However, the covers are things of such beauty. And to begin with, when the first issues came out, it was always a bloke doing something, installing or something or other, and then on the side would be presumably his wife, because everyone was married in those days, gazing at him adoringly because he was so clever, sometimes holding a cup of tea so that he would be nourished when his labours were over. But actually the people who ran the magazines realised quite quickly, I think through their advertisers, that even by then DIY was actually a family thing. The couples were doing it, they were buying new homes, and the sort of increase in home ownership was a crucial factor. So they were doing it together. So quite quickly women started appearing, doing things. So there would be these delightful scenes where one of the big enthusiasms of the 50s was putting hardboard over banisters. Now, you may think this is a really weird thing but it was a big fad, and also putting hardboard over panels on doors. It was supposed to save dusting. And so there would be a picture of the bloke on one side putting in the hardboard, and then his missus on the other side painting, and there they were together. It was so sweet. However, the most ludicrous thing about this was everybody in this room who's done DIY knows that when you do DIY, you get absolutely filthy. You get glue and paint all over the place, there are screws and bits of masking tape all over, but in that world, they're immaculate. None of them wear overalls, none of them has a speck of paint on them, and the bloke has kind of got glossy brill creamed hair, chiseled jaw, creases on his shirts like rolled up, and then she is just back from the hairdresser, so immaculately pressed slacks, and no paint, and you think it's completely unreal. So I laughed at myself stupidly. And then just one other bit of research, I just want to show you, some of you are quite seasoned citizens, so I don't know, does anyone remember, does the name Barry Bucknell mean anything? Very good, that's what I like to hear. Well, there he is. This is one of his masterpieces called The ABC of Do It Yourself. And Barry Bucknell, until I started doing this, I'd never heard of Barry Bucknell. So he was the Mr. DIY on TV in the 1960s, and he did a series for the BBC, and then somebody clever at the BBC thought this man is actual natural TV talent. So they bought a house for him in Ealing, so Derrick's house, and they did a series called Bucknell's House. It ran for 39 consecutive weeks with a colossal audience. And he is, if you look, you can see clips of him on YouTube. He's just one of those people who could just talk to the camera like he was in your living room. And I became very interested. So I thought I would go to the house. The house is still there. So I thought I'm going to go and do some original research rather than just plagiarizing other people's work. So I went to the house and banged on the door, and an old bloke opened it. Because what I wanted to do was to get in and see if there were any original bits of Bucknell work there. Like, he was very big on polystyrene tiles on the ceiling, for instance, and also this hardboarding over the... However, my attempt to find out about him ended in failure because he wouldn't let me in. He said, I can't... What did he say? Something like, I can't do this, and slammed the door in my face. So I don't know whether it's still there or not. Anyway, so that was the kind of fun research side of it.
I was struck by when you were talking about the covers of the magazines, the difference between the ones in the US and the UK post-war. The UK ones are much more about rebuilding.
Yeah, and there it's about building. And also they always wear, in America, they all wear check shirts and jeans. Absolutely invariably.
Yeah, I mean, I come from a family where my father would do DIY, shirt and tie and rolled up.
And with a pencil behind his ear.
Yeah, absolutely.
And a fag in his mouth.
A pipe. So you were involved, in around show and the shop and all the history. What prompted the book?
I knew it was a good story. I was a journalist for many years. I knew it was a good story, but I couldn't see a way of writing it. I don't know about Tring, but where people in the village where I live are extremely touchy. It's very, very easy to put your foot in it. And I was on the parish council for a number of years, and I was constantly putting my foot in it in the early days and having to go around to apologise. At the meeting, I would say something and then realise that I'd offended people, and I had to go around and say sorry to them. And I thought, I can't see how to do this without talking about the customers who use the shop. And once I write about them, they're going to know who they are, and I'm going to have to leave because some people have got a slightly limited sense of humour when it comes to themselves. And then my agent, God bless her, she said, you've got to write a book about the shop, and I explained all that. And she said, no, you've got to write about what's in the shop. So the objects in the shop, where the shop came from, the place it has in the village, its sort of function, and only refer to customers when they're in the shop, as in, you don't have to say who they are, it's just what they say. And I thought, and so I went on a cycle ride and thought that could work, and then I thought, Rivets, Trivets and Galvanised Buckets. That's got a nice ring to it. So I then, by this stage, I'd been commissioned to do the book, so I said, this is what we're going to call it, and they said, no, we don't like that title at all. He said, we think it should be called The Hardware Shop. And I said, that's so boring. And also, it's a complete rip-off of the repair shop on TV, which is how their little minds were working. So we stuck to Rivets and Trivets. So I then had the title. I had this I could see a way to do it, and I then got the material for it. And then the boring bit is the writing of it, but I won't get to it.
Well, that focus on the objects themselves ends up, as I say, being fascinating. I was struck by one of the customers who comes in with the parrot.
Oh yes, yes. That's just about my favourite story. For those of you who haven't read the book, old chap, and he comes in. This is my daughter who was doing shifts. She was from university. She has zero interest in hardware at all, but had a keen interest in earning some money. So she did some shifts in there, and she came back one day and she said, this weird man came in with a parrot called Humphrey. And I had a chat with him, and I said, why have you got a parrot? And he said, well, I used to have German shepherds. He said, but they're very high maintenance, and then they die, whereas parrots are low maintenance and live forever. And Rosie, my daughter, had said, does Humphrey say anything? And the chap said, Humphrey's a parrot, a few words, but he does occasionally say, my name is Humphrey and I'm a vulture. I thought she thought, how is she? Obviously, I couldn't stop laughing. Anyway, that's the end of the book. Just to spoil it for you, for those of you who haven't read it. And I bought some. You'll get it. Look, I'm going to show you my props.
Yes. What's in your bucket?
Right. So I just bought a few of the things. Hang on, I can't see what's in. Right. So where is it? Oh, come on. This is very small. This is very small, but since the book's rivets, so I thought I'd better show you a rivet. So this is what they call a pop rivet, and the ingenuity of this thing. So rivets, the old ordinary rivets, the thing that you sort of bang from either side, have been around for centuries. But the problem with the ordinary rivet, it's fine for building bridges and the Eiffel Tower, it's outside the Titanic, millions and millions of them, but you have to be able to get at both sides of the two bits you're putting together. So somebody thought, there must be some way of doing this where you only have access to one side. And a man, this was in the First World War, a man whose name I now cannot remember. So he had this ingenious idea, so you have the two bits of metal, that goes through, you tap this, you pull it, it snaps off, and as you pull it back through, it expands this tube here to fill the hole. And you think, this is one of the things when I was doing the research for this book, I was constantly amazed by how much cleverer other people are than me, because it took me hours to work out what on earth, even when I had the thing in front of me, how it actually worked. And it changed not everything, but it changed, particularly in the aeronautical industry. So there were literally billions of these were used to build the fighter aircraft and the bombers for in the Second World War. And although welding has now replaced traditional riveting in many areas, these are still used to build aircraft. And they're so clever, you can just do it from one side. So that's the rivet. Do you want to hear about the trivet?
I'd love to hear about the trivet.
Sorry, you have to hear about the trivet. So this is a trivet. This is a sort of fairly traditional trivet. So when I came up with this brilliant title for this book, and I told Shro, and she looked a bit blank, and I said, Shro, we do have trivets in the shop, don't we? And she looked even blanker, and I realised that not merely did we not have trivets, but she had no idea what a trivet was. So I said, I can't write a book called Rivets and Trivets without having some trivets in the shop. So she said, leave it to me. And then she texted me a while later, I've got the trivets. So I went down there and she showed me these things, which were like silicon heat retardant mats. And I said, those are not trivets. She said, it says trivet on the bottom. I said, these are not trivets, because trivets have to have legs. And this is the classic 3 trivet. So that's where it gets the tree from. But I will allow 4 legs, 5 legs, even 6 legs. But a trivet must have legs. And these were originated from just to keep things warm on top of old-fashioned cookers, or to cook puddings or steam puddings, so puddings inside steaming pots, or on the table, so the table didn't get burnt. You put them like that. And they were made in millions, but in this country, I think maybe because we've got too much history, so nobody pays much attention to them. You'll find them, they're almost indestructible, so you find them in junk shops all over the place. But in America, they're very, very, very serious about their trivets. And there's a woman called Lynn Rozak who I got in touch with, and she has written not one, but two books entirely about trivets. And she is a leading light in the pressed iron. So pressed irons are pretty much the same. So the Pressed Iron and Trivet Collectors of America, PITCA, organization, who have a 3-day conference every year somewhere in Pennsylvania, where for 3 days people come and talk about nothing. Can you imagine? It's such a thing. I thought of going, and then I thought, actually, I might run out of things to say. And I've only got 2 of them anyway. So anyway, that's your trivet.
What was the name of the magazine? Is it
Trivetology? Trivetology is her website, yeah. Trivetology, and all her trivets are on there. And she actually sent me a couple of nice pictures, which are in the book, of her best trivets.
That is one of the things that amazes me, is the passion that once you start looking into the history of something and seeing it with its own history and
things that you say, so like the galvanized bucket. There's a whole history about the process of galvanization, which is dipping metal in zinc to protect it from rust. And the name Galvani, who was an Italian, well, actually not a scientist at all, he was a complete fraud, but never mind. You have to read the book to find out in what way he was a fraud. But the process itself, which has been hugely important in terms of construction and so forth. And the applications of galvanization, I don't know around Tring, but I'm sure there is somewhere or other that there will be near here, there will be what is referred to as a Nissen hut. So those kind of circular things like that, sitting often on air bases and so forth. And that was invented or devised by a man called Peter Nissen in the First World War. He was in the army, and people were very cold and wet and miserable, and they didn't have anywhere dry. And he thought there must be an easy way to provide accommodation. And he came up with this system where, so galvanized corrugated iron, curved like this over a frame, bolted to a concrete base. 5 hours, 6 men, 5 hours. There's your Nissen hut, hospitals, all the rest of it. People were able to, the soldiers on the Western Front were able to be warm and dry. And had they known who he was, they would have had a much higher opinion of him than they did of any of their generals. And again, it's one of those things where you just think the application is more, in a way, is more interesting than the process itself. So that's the bucket. How are we doing for time?
It was interesting to me how several of the inventions, it was the use, like you said, the application was a wartime use. So
yeah, I think yes. I think also that there were lots of sort of tricky problems which needed kind of this is not so much, this was just before the war and had nothing to do with wartime application, but it's one of my, so everybody knows raw plugs. And there isn't a shed, a workshop, nobody who's ever put up a shelf. None of them. Everyone knows what a raw plug is. Even I know what a raw plug is. I've had some very mainly disastrous experiences with raw plugs. But so who thought of this? Before raw plugs existed, if you were screwing, putting up a shelf and you want to put screws into a wall, you took out a bit of plaster and you fitted a wooden bung into that space, and you tried to keep it as level as you can, and then you screwed into the wood, which has got obvious disadvantages. It damages the plaster, it's very difficult to get it level, it's unstable. And this man, James Rawling, who was doing some work just before the war for the British Museum, and he thought there must be a cleverer way. So he went home, if you look at the drawings he submitted for his patent application, you can see exactly how his mind worked. And he came up with this idea of a tapered tube of jute with a hole down the middle, into which you screw your screw, and as you screw the screw further in, the thing expands to fit the hole. I read about that. I thought, that's just, why have I never had an idea as clever as that? And fortunately, because one of the things about many of these inventions is people who actually came up with the invention didn't do particularly well out of it, but Rawling did very well out of it and became a wealthy man living in Wimbledon. And they're still made. So the company he founded is still going in Scotland. And you think, where would we be without raw plugs?
There is so much creativity and resourcefulness in the book of people, like you say, who saw a tricky problem and put their minds to it.
Like this, the screwdriver. Again, where would you be without your screwdriver? The story is sort of quite long and convoluted, but so there are the two kinds of screwdriver are that. So that's the kind of flathead or slotted screwdriver, the ordinary one, and the Phillips screwdriver with the cruciform top that fits into. And everyone who's used one of these has had a bad experience at some point where it slips out of the screw and usually ends up somewhere in their hand, causing extreme pain and a lot of really bad language. And so that was the old-fashioned screw, and that was around for centuries. But people thought there must be a better way. And there were two or three kind of false starts in the 19th century. One particular favourite of mine, a man called Robertson, a Canadian, not actually a false start because you can still buy them. And he devised so instead of having the cruciform like that, it is a sort of tapered square, and it fits exactly into a square top screw. And it's so clever because you can actually put the screw on the end of the screwdriver without it ever falling off and screw it in like that, and it cannot slip, which is everyone who uses these knows. The curse of these is when the top of the screw starts flattening under pressure, and you get to that point halfway where you can't get it in or out. And you then have to go and get one of those stupid saws and try and saw off the screw, and then you lose your temper again. But so the man Phillips, so this is known as the Phillips, he didn't actually invent the thing at all. He just had he was an American, he had the bright idea of paying somebody else who'd had the idea, and he went to General Motors and said, this is the answer to, this is in the 1930s, many of your problems in assembling automobiles. And he made a colossal fortune, mainly by selling the licenses to make them, particularly to Nettlefolds, who are the big screw manufacturers in this country, late now GKN. And so, yeah, there you are. Where would you be without them?
So why then do you think the Robertson hasn't caught on as much? Because I've used a Robertson.
Oh, have you?
Yes. And it's marvellous.
Yeah.
So why are we not all using Robertson?
Well, because he set up, actually he was a wartime casualty. He set up, he did well in Canada, came over to England just at the beginning of the First World War, set up his and then his factory was requisitioned to make mortar bombs. Oh. And he was so disillusioned and fed up that he went back to Canada.
So it feels like a gap in the market.
Well, there are other ones, but actually the thing is that for normal DIY, actually those pretty much cover it, and accidents and blood and injury are part of DIY life, in my experience anyway.
That's one of the things that struck me when you were talking about the development of sort of DIY shows on the telly. That now so many of them are people coming in to fix other people's mistakes. There's a kind of sort of joy. Well,
it's a sort of classic reality TV thing where I don't watch these programs, I may say, but I did watch some of them for the purposes of this. So some idiot makes a complete hash of everything and has a nervous breakdown, and then the heroes arrive, like kind of gods from another planet, and he goes off to the pub or something, and when he comes back, the whole place is turned into a palace by all these geniuses, and then they burst into tears. It's all very emotional, and this happens every week. And actually, to me, it's very predictable. One of the ones that interests me actually is Grand Designs, which is a slightly more elevated concept, where and what's good about that is that Kevin MacLeod, he doesn't actually try and repair these people's often appalling blunders. He just watches while they go bankrupt and their marriages break up and their houses fall down. But actually, he came to Heath and Watkins recently to do some filming for a program that he's making. And I met him out in the street. I knew who he was, and strangely enough, he didn't know who I was. And I said something to him which I thought was quite amusing, and he didn't find it at all amusing.
Oh dear. I think maybe we have time for one more thing.
One more. So I think this is a very fascinating one because it's one of the ones that everybody has. Everybody has WD-40. Life without WD-40 is unimaginable. But some of you will know, particularly if you've read my book, why it's called WD-40. Anyone know why it's called WD-40? Very good. And 40? Very good. So 39 times it didn't work, and the 40th time it worked. And this was a man from San Diego in California. He worked for an engineering firm. He spent ages up in his garage. And he gave the formula to his company, and it was used, had a very limited use. And then the company was taken over by a much more kind of far-sighted individual, and he had the brilliant idea, which is what made this, is making it as an aerosol. That's what made it into a multi-billion pound world concrete product. The strange thing is that the man who invented it was called Norman Larson, and the bloke who invented the aerosol was called Norman Lawson, which is a very unfortunate coincidence of names from the point of view of the bloke who actually invented it, because he's been completely written out of the whole history of WD-40 until my book came out. Unfortunately, he's long dead, so he won't know the justice has been done. But it is one of those things, and I've got in there no time to talk about it. Swarfiga is another one where you just think, how would we manage? How would you get, when your mower won't, how would you treat your mower when you'll get it out of the shed in March, or the first cut of the year, and the bloody thing won't start? And if you didn't have this, you'd be some...
Well, I think, I'm sure we could talk about this all day, to be honest. And I'm learning all kinds of things, like I say. I'm sure, though, there must be some questions. I think probably not one or two questions.
I'm very happy. Can I just say, I'm very happy to answer any questions except questions to do with practical matters.
I'm just
for
interested,
obvious reasons.
what happened to your finger?
That was cooking.
Sorry, galvanised buckets and things. How much is made in England anymore?
Well, the answer is very little. But yeah, it's easy to be said. Attached to our shop, we have a mower workshop, which is run by Greg, who figures in the book. He mends mowers, but his passion is motorcycles, and particularly the Triumph motorcycle. So if you said to Greg, "Isn't it a shame that more of these things aren't made in this country?" You would, if you were lucky, escape an hour and a half later, having been on receiving end of Greg's opinions about British engineering since the great days of Triumph in the 1960s, and the causes whereof, which you particularly would not want to hear about. And yes, of course, the stuff in our shop made in China, most of it's made in China, or Korea and such like. Does it bother me? I suppose it's the same with fishing tackle.
Let me just, I want to introduce Gilbert Grace here on the front row. He's, what generation are you for the Grace?
Grace and Son goes back to 1750, although it is referred to in the 1600s something. I came over this shop in 1947 and still work. But my grandson here, Jordan, he has taken over and moved it on a lot.
I've been in there this afternoon. You're doing the refillables, which was one of the first things we did at Schroe did, was to start refillables. And your shop it's like a cathedral. It's magnificent. And it's so big as well. You also do haberdashery. So one of the things that Schroe did last winter was my son had an office, he's a journalist, he worked in an office at the back of the shop, and she kicked him out. He's now in the shed in the garden, and turned his office into a haberdashery department. And so people now come in, and they disappear, because it's just around the corner. They disappear. I don't know anything about haberdashery, you'd be surprised to hear. But you hear these kind of excited cries when they come across particular threads or thimbles or whatever it is. And isn't it wonderful that you can do that? And the fact that you live in a town which can support two hardware shops is, somebody should make more than one TV program about it.
Yeah, so I've seen tremendous changes in my lifetime. One was tipping the nails down to the cellar, tumble them down, and then have to put them in pigeonholes. That's when far more DIY was done.
Yeah.
You know, people making rabbit
But I
hutches.
presume you would still sell, I mean, occasionally somebody comes into our shop and asks for, they're not very popular, a single nail
Yes.
or a single screw, but so this has to be put in a little brown paper bag and there you are. And then when they go down the road, there's some grinding of teeth. But you have to be able to give that sort of service, don't you?
Yes, it is annoying, yes, the amount of time.
So be warned, the rest of you. Don't go in there and ask for don't go to Grace's and ask for a single screw. How old were you when you started it up? This is to tell me how old you are now.
Well, I'm 87 now.
So you were young and enthusiastic, fresh-faced.
Well, I actually go into the workshops at the rear when there used to be 5 forges at one stage. Wow. When I started, there was three forges, and then we had a big fire, and that all came to a halt. One 12-year-old, I think it was, set fire to the building next door that spread onto ours, nearly bust us.
But not quite, thank goodness.
No.
Well, well done, Graces. I'm hugely impressed.
Metcalfe's couldn't provide it.
Yeah, I went down there and had a chat with them, and they said we can't come. And I said, well, take it up with the timing is nothing to do with me. They could have easily had this after you closed.
You said you did a lot of research for the book. Was there anything you found historically that's been sold in hardware shops that's not sold anymore because it's fallen out of fashion, but you wish you could still sell it?
Something that used to be. Well, there are a lot of things that you're not allowed to sell anymore because they're highly toxic. And we do a lot of gardening stuff, and we do, I think probably unlike you, a huge amount of our business is plants and associated things. And of course, people are always coming in saying, I want some glyphosate, and so, but it works. It kills the weeds. I mean, one of the things that I noticed in your shop, refillables, and to begin with, there was quite a bit of resistance from the older people because the idea of bringing your bottle back, but it's surprising how quickly people got used to the idea of not buying fairy liquid or whatever it was, and chucking the bottle away. And Shro was very, very sort of quick to see that as a sort of, one person came into the shop and said, do you do refillables? And she said, no, I don't, but I soon will be. And she went off, and within a couple of weeks, she had them. And but there is, at Christmas time, she has a Christmas tree in the window. And on top of it, this was my son's idea, is instead of the normal fairy, is an old-fashioned fairy liquid bottle, and people love it.
One of the things I was struck about having changed was taking the arsenic out of flypapers.
Yes, well, I mean, that's the example of what you're referring to. I mean, it goes back a very, very long time. Yeah, arsenic, I mean, I didn't really realise this. Arsenic was used in an incredible range of products in the 19th century, and long after doctors had started warning that actually it wasn't terribly good for you. Particularly things like sort of paint and perfumes and makeup was absolutely full of it, and full of mercury as well. Yeah, and it was very good for if you fancied a bit of mass murder. It was very handy.
Yes, I was quite struck by that, actually.
Well,
there was a woman, where was the woman? Is it in Hungary, who was extracting it?
Yes, in Hungary they had one of the most famous mass murders stories of all time. In this village in Hungary where, for various sociological reasons, which I won't go into, the women wanted to get rid of not merely their husbands, but their annoying children, their annoying old parents and such like. And there was a particular woman who extracted arsenic from flypapers, was the thing, and something like, they think they dug up all the bodies, something like 40 people were murdered over a number of years in this village, and they made films about it and so forth. But My research did not permit me to go all the way to Hungary to see how they were doing their.
You're very quiet bunch.
Good. Well, in that case, I've just got. So what? I've shown you enough objects. The one thing I would like to. There are two things I would if I've got just a little bit of time.
Yeah.
So I'd like to read one paragraph from the book, which I think will chime with you, Mr. Grace. So it's about why people like hardware shops. The hardware shop stands for familiar and reassuring values: reliability, competence, trustworthiness, usefulness, time for others, maintaining things so that they last. These are qualities that many people suspect have become hard to find in the wider world, where their elected leaders display almost none of them. The metrics and algorithms deployed to organize almost every aspect of the working of society have no place in the hardware shop. It is the repudiation of throwaway, the antithesis of the click of a mouse delivery van version of consumerism. The hardware shop, in Shro's hands and your hands as well, stands for the traditional, the real, the permanent, the ordinary. It is a rock to hold on to in a sea of threatening currents. I still like that, even though I've read it several times now, and I'm very pleased with that paragraph. And the other thing I was just going to refer to, because everyone who comes in and always talks about the famous Four Candles sketch, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, and of course I was familiar with it, and I did some kind of digging around. You can still find it on YouTube. But the thing that interested me about that sketch, which was first broadcast in 1976 in the two Ronnies, so that's nearly 50 years ago. And I watched it for the first time for probably 30 years, and I actually laughed out aloud at it. And the moment where, so having gone through the Four Candles, and he then says, there's this thing about O's, and he brings the garden hose, and he says, no, O's, and so the letter O, and then poor old Ronnie Corbett goes up his ladder, comes down with an O, and Barker says, no, I need 2 O's for my house, more repos. And I thought, why is this still funny? Because almost no comedy from the 1970s, or indeed the 80s, 90s, 2000s stands looking at again. If you look at things like Fawlty Towers and Monty Python, they're absolutely, try and get your kids or grandchildren, they're sort of completely stony-faced. So why is this still funny? And of course, the answer is quite obvious, which is that the hardware shop in that sketch, and our hardware shop, and your hardware shop, and Metcalfe's, and all proper hardware shops are the same. They look and feel the same now as they did in 1976 or 1956. Obviously, some things have changed, but they're like good bookshops. They have the same feel about them, and people, so they're familiar, so they haven't dated, they are timeless, and that's why that sketch is still funny. And actually, interestingly, it was written by Ronnie Barker himself, but under his pseudonym, Gerald Wiley, and he wrote a lot of the Ronnie's material, but he was very odd bloke, Ronnie Barker, and he didn't like people to know it was him. So they would have a kind of script meeting about what they were going to do, and someone would say, we've had some very good material from this chap, Gerald Wiley, but nobody knows who he is. And it was ages before he revealed, oh, actually I'm him, yeah. Anyway, it is still funny. Have a look at it on YouTube. It's still a good laugh. Right, that's all I was going to say at the end of it.
Right.
And just one final thing.
Oh.
If ever you are, not that you need it because you live in Tring, but if ever you happen to be in South Oxfordshire and you need some rat poison or a mouse trap or anything like that, or some really nice plants, which maybe you can't get to, you'd be very welcome. Sunning Common, South Oxfordshire, Wood Lane, very welcome, open 6 days a week.
Wow. What an offer. I'd just like to thank you. That was fascinating. Like I say, I've learned a number of things reading the book and listening today. And it's been lovely thinking about a shop, a kind of shop that we're all familiar with in a new way. Thank you for coming to Tring. And I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking Tom for his time.
So Tom's going to be signing. I know quite a few of you've got books already, but obviously the shop is open for business, so do pop in there and get a book. And Tom will be in the foyer on the right. So thank you very much, and thank you to Pippa Chapel for interviewing.